Hello, everyone. If you are out in the lobby, I promise there will be coffee momentarily, and you can get up and get it without penalty. So come on in. Okay. People are serious about their coffee. And I am one of those people. Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Usually it's the early evening when I'm speaking to all of you, so it's very early in the morning for all of us to be together. It's a whole different kind of relationship. Let's go with it. Welcome to the Firehouse Center for the Arts, to the first symposium ever that I can find dedicated to the life and times of Newburyport privateers during the Revolution and, of course, their colleagues in the world around them. I'm Bethany Groff-Dureau. I'm the Executive Director of the Museum of Old Newbury, and I especially want to thank our illustrious speakers here in the front row for honoring us with their presence, knowledge, and skill. Thank you to the Firehouse Center, especially Justin up in the booth. Let's give him a round of applause. What you may or may not know is that Frozen, the children's performance of Frozen, closed last night. So Justin's, feel free to tip the sound guy, right? He's incredible. Good job, Justin. And of course, everyone at the Firehouse has been so kind and accommodating. Custom House Maritime Museum. I know James Russell flew in on the, hey, there he is. He just got here. Has been a wonderful partner for us in this. Lowell's Boat Shop. Theater in the Open. This has been an incredible partnership event, and I am just so gratified for the help and support of all of our colleagues. Of course, thank you to our board, our staff, Shelley, the Munchies Maven out there doing her thing. Somebody pointed out that the bagels are not historically accurate, but, prove it. And thank you, of course, to you, our community. We can't do any of these fun events without your enthusiastic participation, so thank you so much. Our whole staff and all of our volunteers and docents at the museum have just been absolutely stellar, from chopping vegetables to pulling documents from the archive. It's been wonderful, and of course, answering the phone and taking reservations, so thank you. The events that began last February that commemorate and celebrate the 250th anniversary of the start of the American Revolution, along with many other exciting events across the state, are sponsored by the Massachusetts Office of Travel and Tourism. Some of you have heard this spiel before at our other events. They have been an incredible support for us this year and last year. It's part of the Mass 250 campaign. We are very grateful to be one of the communities chosen for the second year in a row to tell our revolutionary story. We were just shy of 10,000 people who attended a Revolutionary War event last year, and we will definitely beat that this year. So the grant that sponsors this event, as I mentioned, is a partnership with Custom House Maritime Museum, Lowell's Boat Shop, Newburyport Chamber of Commerce, the North of Boston Convention and Visitors Bureau, Firehouse Center, Theater in the Open, all sorts of other community partners. So just a wonderful community-wide event. While I have you, I would like to encourage you to support all of these local arts and cultural organizations and historical organizations in the community. We are all working together, and we are a multiplier of each other, as you can see here today. Volunteer, donate, encourage, and support. And without further ado, it gives me a great pleasure to introduce a man who agrees with me on the fundamental premise of this day, which is that Newburyport is the center of the universe. Please join me in welcoming Mayor Sean Reardon.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming to Newburyport today. Welcome to the Firehouse Center for the Arts here at our historic waterfront. It is my pleasure to kick off today's Revolutionary Privateers at Sea Symposium, a program that highlights such an important chapter in our city's story and its connection to the wider world. Newburyport has always been shaped by water. From our earliest days, this harbor connected us, not only to neighboring communities, but to a global network of trade, ideas, and during the Revolutionary War, to the fight for independence itself. The privateers who sailed from ports like ours played a vital role in that effort, disrupting supply lines, strengthening the colonial cause, and helping to shape the outcome of the revolution. What makes today especially meaningful is that we are not just looking back, we are continuing a long tradition of learning, curiosity, and civic engagement that defines Newburyport. This is a community that has always been outward-looking and deeply connected to the broader world. I want to thank the organizers, historians, and speakers who have made today possible, and all of you for being here and committing your time to a full day of exploration and discussion. As you move through today's sessions, I hope you take pride in the role Newburyport played in our nation's founding and reflect on how that legacy continues to shape who we are today. Thank you again for being here, and I hope you have a great day here in Newburyport.
Thank you, Mayor Reardon. My name is Bill Quigley. I'm the co-president of the museum. This is the fourth full-day symposium that we have held in the last 5 years, and I'm wondering how many, by a show of hands, have attended one or more of the symposium over the last 5 years. Wow. Thank you so much for your support. As Bethany said, it takes a community to put something like this together. And if you're a member of the museum, we thank you. If you're members of the Custom House, we thank you. Of the Lowell's Boat Shop, thank you. Theater in the Open, thank you for supporting these ventures. I also want to reiterate, in particular, how much work went into this on the part of the staff at the museum. Shelley Swafford, please, a hand for these people. Ashley Service, Sierra Gitlin, our docents, our volunteers, my fellow members of the board, and especially our executive director. Please give a big round of applause again for Bethany Groff-Dureau.
You can applaud me when the tech works all day. That is what I will be most proud of at the end of the day. Just a couple quick little housekeeping notes that, of course, I failed to mention earlier. Please silence your phones. The restrooms, as you may have discovered, are downstairs. So this is going to be a long day. Feel free to get up, move around as needed. The door on the right-hand side, by where Mr. Mayor is standing, will be locked. So you'll need to go out the other door during the day's events. So just a couple little notes. I also wanted to thank our live stream participants who are out there all across the world. It was incredibly gratifying to look at the contact information for our live stream audience. They are in New Zealand, Germany, England, and of course all over this country, and some right here in town who are watching from the comfort of their sofa. So hi, Mom and Dad out there in live stream land. So with that, I'm going to put one of my spare pairs of reading glasses on and introduce our first speaker. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Eric Jay Dolin, who is the author of 17 books on American maritime history, wildlife, and the environment, such as Leviathan, Black Flags, Blue Waters, Left for Dead, and A Furious Sky. Dolin's books have won many awards, including the John Lyman Award for U.S. Maritime History, Francis Tavern Museum Book Award, the National Society for the Daughters of the American Revolution Excellence in American History Book Award, and the Samuel Eliot Morrison Book Award for Naval Literature. Many of his books have been chosen must-reads by the Massachusetts Center for the Book, with degrees from Brown, Yale, and a PhD from MIT, and he also happens to be my mother's favorite author. That is high praise indeed. He previously worked in environmental policy before becoming a full-time writer. His forthcoming book is The Wreck of the Mentor, a true story of death, despair, and deliverance in the age of sail. Please join me in welcoming my friend, Eric Jay Dolin.
Well, thanks for that wonderful introduction, and I want to thank everybody who is supporting this conference. It's a pleasure to be here. I was reading a little bit about the history of this Firehouse Center, really amazing history, and it's really nice to read about a community that comes together to save such an important resource and create a place for the community to gather. And I have to give a special thanks to Bethany, who invited me to participate in this presentation. It was late in the day on June 3rd, 1780, when Salem captain Jonathan Harridan and his privateer, the Pickering, were heading for the friendly port of Bilbao, Spain. The British privateer Achilles, however, stood in the way, nobody would have faulted Harridan had he fled in the face of this superior foe. While the Pickering had a crew of 38 men and 16 cannons, the Achilles bristled with 138 men and 43 cannons. Hardly a fair fight, but that's not how Harridan saw it. He relished a chance to strike a blow for the revolutionary cause. Turning to the British prisoner who had just informed him of the Achilles' might, Harridan said, "I shan't run from her." Oops. And he didn't. As the Achilles began its advance, Harridan told his men that though the Achilles appeared to be superior to them in force, he had no doubt that they should beat her off if they were firm and steady in their fire. Meanwhile, in Bilbao, word quickly spread among the community that there was about to be a massive naval battle just offshore, and about 1,000 people rushed down to witness the spectacle. Booming broadsides and muskets filled the air. One of Harridan's crew said that while shot flew around him, Harridan was as calm and steady as amidst a shower of snowflakes. The battle raged for 2 more hours. Then Harridan ordered his men to fill the cannons with bar shot, which many of you are no doubt familiar, is just a cannonball cut in half attached to an iron bar. When that comes out the muzzle of a cannon, it starts to spin wildly and it can shred sails, rigging, and even damage masts and spars. This did major damage to the Achilles, and having had enough, the Achilles turned about and tried to flee the scene. Harridan chased, but despite the Achilles' injuries, it was too fast for Harridan's Pickering. So Harridan spun around, recollected the Eagle, which was the Golden Eagle, a British vessel he had captured earlier, which the Achilles had taken back at the beginning of the battle. Now, all told, one of Pickering's crew had been killed, his head sheared off by a cannonball, and 8 of his men were injured. How many were injured or killed on the British ship is unknown. And I want to tell you a little bit about this plaque. This is the top third of a plaque. It's about 2 feet wide and about 4 feet tall. And while I was researching the book, which this is a key point, it was during COVID, right, in the beginning of COVID. So while I was researching the book, I found a reference to this plaque, which was placed in Salem in 1909 by the Sons of the American Revolution to honor Harridan's heroics during the American Revolution. It's said that the plaque was hanging on the outside of a house in the intersection in Salem where the Witch Museum is and where Jerry's Army Navy used to be. So I got on my bike, I live in Marblehead, I rode over to Salem, I walked around that intersection, I went up driveways, I'm sure people were wondering what I was doing, and I found 2 or 3 plaques, but I didn't find this plaque. So I went back home and I called an historian in Salem and I said, "Do you know what happened to that plaque to Jonathan Harridan?" And she started laughing and she said, "It's down the street in a Korean barbecue restaurant." So I got back on my bike, I went over to this Korean barbecue restaurant, I walked in. Being COVID, there was not a single customer in the restaurant. She was so excited because she thought I was there to buy food. I had to unfortunately tell her, "No, I'm actually here to see that plaque behind your head." And there on the wall is this plaque. I don't know if it's still there because I gave a talk to the Sons of the American Revolution a year or 2 later, and afterwards they asked for contact information and they wanted to purchase the plaque. So I don't know what happened there. But I think the fact that this plaque was hidden in a restaurant, and no offense to Korean barbecue restaurants, is an indication of how privateering has been treated, sort of relegated to the background or forgotten about altogether. Now, Harridan remained in Bilbao for 2 months before heading back to Salem. On a return voyage, the Pickering captured 3 British vessels, and when Harridan pulled into Salem, the owners of the Pickering honored their intrepid captain by giving him this silver tankard and 2 silver goblets inscribed with the profile of the Pickering and his initials. Now, during his tenure in the Massachusetts Navy and as a privateer, Harridan took many prizes and brought back hundreds of British cannons and at least as many British prisoners. He died of tuberculosis at the age of 59 in 1803, and his obituary in the Salem Gazette lauded him as one of the most able and valiant naval commanders that the wars produced. The Pickering was one of nearly 2,000 American privateers, and Harridan was one of tens of thousands of privateersmen who served on their decks during the American Revolution. Privateers were armed vessels owned and outfitted by private individuals who had government permission to capture enemy ships during times of war. That permission came in the form of a letter of marque, an official legal document that gave the bearer the right to capture those enemy ships and bring them back into port as prizes or spoils of war. The proceeds from the auction of these prizes would be split 50-50 between the owner and his investors and the men who were on the ship doing the fighting and the capturing. Despite the contributions made by Harridan and thousands of other privateersmen, many believe that privateering was just a sideshow during the American Revolution. Privateering has long been given short shrift in histories of the Revolution and even in maritime histories of that conflict. Rebels at Sea fills the void by offering a comprehensive account of privateering that demonstrates that it was critical to winning the war. American privateersmen took the maritime fight to the British and made them bleed. In countless daring actions against British merchant ships and not a few British warships, privateers caused maritime insurance rates to rise precipitously, diverted critical British resources to protecting their own ships and to attacking American privateers, added to British weariness over the war, and played a starring role in bringing France into the war on the side of the Americans, which was a critical turning point. On the domestic front, privateering brought much-needed goods and military supplies into the new nation, provided cash infusions for the war effort, boosted coastal economies, and bolstered Americans' confidence that they might actually be able to win in this quixotic war against the most powerful force or nation of the day. Thousands of books have approached the revolution from virtually every angle. Rebels at Sea places privateersmen at the very center of the war effort. It demonstrates that when the United States was only a tenuous idea, they stepped forward and risked their lives to help make it a reality. In fighting against the British on the open ocean, the Americans relied on 4 different forces. There were state navies, Washington's secret navy, which only operated for about a year after the beginning of the war, the Continental Navy, and privateers. And of these 4, privateers were by far the most numerous and the most effective, capturing between 1,600 and 1,800 British ships, worth many millions of pounds at the docks where they were sold. Massachusetts, which likes to be the first in a lot of things, was the first to step forward and authorize privateering with a statute in November of 1775, spearheaded by Elbridge Gerry, and that's Gary, not Jerry, as in gerrymandering. You got to say gerrymandering. And he is from my hometown of Marblehead. And the importance of the Massachusetts Privateering Act in unleashing the privateering spirit throughout the colonies became even clearer in hindsight. Some 40 years later, after the Revolution, John Adams would write that the passage of the Massachusetts Privateering Act is one of the most important, documents in history. The Declaration of Independence is a trifle in comparison with it. I would argue that since that time, the Declaration of Independence has taken on a little bit more importance. Now, New Hampshire and Rhode Island followed suit in early 1776 with their own privateering statutes. At the same time, pressure was growing for the Continental Congress to pass a privateering law so all 13 colonies could issue letters of marque instead of it being a piecemeal process, colony by colony. And the Continental Congress did that on March 23rd of 1776 when it passed the privateering law. With their capital tied up at the docks, ship owners such as Eliot Haskett Derby here, of Derby Wharf fame, eagerly pursued privateering. Prizes brought in many goods and ships that they could sell. And actually, Derby is often cited as being America's first millionaire, although I think he gets a run for his money with John Jacob Astor and Stephen Girard. Now, many men invested in privateers. Indeed, privateering spurred a speculative frenzy all across the colonies. Among the more illustrious speculators were Generals George Washington, Nathaniel Greene, and Henry Knox, as well as Paul Revere. Privateer captains would usually be hired directly and offered the largest number of shares of any prizes taken. Now, I want to stop for a moment on this slide. Mr. Davis here, if you ever go to the Cape Ann Museum, attached to the museum is his house, and over the fireplace mantle is this painting. Now again, COVID plays a little role here because at the time that I was writing this book, it was during COVID. My wife was working from home. My daughter came back from New York, where she's a literary agent, to work from home. My son, who's in college, came home. And I have to tell you, all of them were the worst coworkers I have ever had. Because I'm alone during most of my normal days, and I kept popping out of my office to talk to them. But my family, they're very hard workers, and they kept shooing me back in to the office. And my wife rued the fact that when we built the office, she didn't install a lock on the outside so she could lock me in. So I had to often go back and do more work and then to come out at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock and we'd be able to have family time. But at that point, my daughter had not read a single one of my books. Neither had my son. And so I saw this picture and I called Lily in, and she was single at the time. She still is. That's not a pitch for a single male, but I'm just letting you know. So she's gorgeous. So she, I called her into my office. I said, Lily, take a look at Elias here. You know, he was a privateering captain. And Lily takes a good long look at Elias, and she goes, you know, Dad, I could really get into privateering. So, and she since has read, I think, one of my books, 1.5. It's sort of like the cobbler's family. But anyway, whoops, oh, what did I? Well, that's interesting. That's the death button. Okay, I didn't know that. Okay, while crewmen were sometimes known to owners prior to being hired, in most cases they were not, and they had to be invited in. It was something called a hearty welcome. The ship owner would hire a local pub, give out free booze, invite anybody to come down, partake, and sign the articles of the privateer. Now, black men served on many privateers. Some were freemen, such as this individual, James Fortin, who at age 14 in 1781 signed on to the Pennsylvania privateer, the Royal Lewis. Now, there are a couple of reasons that he signed on. Fortin at the time, his parents were free, which was unusual, and he was free, and he could read. And on July 8th, when the Declaration of Independence was read not too far from his house, he went to listen to the oration. And he heard those immortal words, all men are created equal. And he thought, well, maybe this new nation might live up to that credo. And then years later in 1780, Massachusetts passed the first act relating to the abolition of slavery in the colonies, an act for the gradual abolition of slavery. And this also gave James Fortin hope. So he signed on to the Royal Lewis, which was captained by Stephen Decatur Sr. You probably heard of Stephen Decatur Jr., the War of 1812. And he was lucky that he did, because they went out, they captured 7 prizes, brought them back, sold them for a bunch of money. Fortin had some money in his pocket. He was so excited that he signed up for another voyage on the Royal Lewis. And in hindsight, he shouldn't have been so eager, because barely a day out of port, the Royal Lewis was captured by the HMS Amphion, which was captained by a guy named John Baisley. Now, Fortin got incredibly worried at this point, because he knew, as did most colonists, that people of his complexion who were captured by a British ship were typically sent to the Caribbean, where they were sold in the slave marts in the sugar colonies. and he thought that that was going to be his fate. But fortunately for him, John Baisley, the captain of the ship, had a 12-year-old son on board who needed a companion. And for whatever reasons, we don't have them, Baisley tapped James Fortin. And for 3 weeks, he got along very well with Baisley's son. So when they pulled into New York Harbor, where there were a number of British warships that had been turned into prison hulks waiting for the crew of the Royal Louis, Baisley gave Fortin a choice. He said, you can either go with my son back to London, be his ward, have money, freedom, education, or you can disembark here with the other men of the Royal Louis and be put on one of the prison ships. What do you decide? Fortin, who is a true patriot, said, I want to go with my men. And he did. And Baisley was an honorable man. He went to the superintendent of prisons and he said, you know, this guy James Fortin is a good person. If you ever have a prisoner exchange, please put him near the top, which would be very unusual for a black man of that day who wasn't vouched for. So 8 months later, there was a prisoner exchange, and James Fortin was given his freedom. Later in life, after America won the American Revolution, James Fortin became one of the leading sailmakers in Philadelphia. In 1842, when he died, he was worth $70,000, and he helped to make the words of the Declaration of Independence ring true for his fellow man, because he supported the launching of William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator. And William Lloyd has a nice statue right up the street. So he was an angel investor in The Liberator, and The Liberator, an anti-slavery magazine or newspaper, I think played a major role in what transpired later. Now, other black men were enslaved persons who signed on after running away from their owners, and then there were many owners who rented out their enslaved individuals to privateers to make money, because they pocketed any money that those men would have earned. Now, this painting was, at the time, was years ago, thought to be the only known painting of a black privateersman, American, during the Revolution. And as such, it was valued at $300,000. It was owned by a urologist in Rhode Island. Not that him being a urologist has anything in particular to do with it, but it was used in many books to represent black individuals' participation in the Revolution. And in the year 2000, France's Tavern Museum wanted to have an exhibit on the role of those individuals in the Revolution, and they contacted the urologist and asked to use this painting as the centerpiece for the exhibition. He said, great. He sent it out to a local art restorer to get it cleaned up a little bit, because it had been in his dining room all those years. The restorer took some solvent, an approved solvent, started wiping at one of the fingers, and the black paint came off, revealing a white finger beneath. It turns out that in the 20th century, somebody had decided correctly that a unique painting of a black American privateersman or mariner during the American Revolution would be much more valuable than an unusual but not unique painting of a white mariner during the American Revolution, doctored it, painted over it, did a forgery. And he was right, it was more valuable, because the value of this went from $300,000 down to $3,000, and France's Tavern Museum rescinded its invitation to have it be the centerpiece of their exhibit. It went back into the dining room of the urologist. Okay. Now, many have argued that privateersmen were motivated more by greed than patriotism. Famed naval officer John Paul Jones believed that it was nothing but greed. A less cynical assessment views privateers as being motivated by a combination of profits and patriotism. And this view, I believe very strongly, is closer to the truth. The perspective of most privateersmen is best reflected in the comments of privateersman and soldier Christopher Prince, who said, looking back on his long revolutionary career, through the whole course of the war, I have had two motives in view. One was the freedom of my country, and the other was the luxuries of life. Privateers experienced many triumphs and tragedies during the war. One of the most successful privateers was the Pennsylvania brig Holker, which brought in 71 prizes over 4 years with 11 different captains. And those prizes were sold to the docks of Philadelphia and raised nearly £2 million or dollars. One of the worst tragedies to befall privateers occurred with the Penobscot expedition. It was the largest American maritime force launched during the Revolution. It consisted of 19 ships, 12 of which were privateers. Their mission was to dislodge British forces that were building a fort up in Penobscot Bay, where Castine is today. And the reason that the British were building this fort, Fort George, was specifically to have a launching point for raids on those privateering nests all along the coast in the American colonies. The expedition sailed from Boston on July 19, 1779. Poor organization and leadership and a critical delay in launching the attack, they dithered for weeks, led to a fiasco when on August 14th, the Royal Navy arrived at the mouth of Penobscot Bay in force. It was a complete rout. In the end, 16 American ships were burned by their own men to keep them from falling into the hands of the enemy, and the rest were captured or sunk. And it must have been quite a sight, because right before those British ships showed up, the men who had been running this operation, the two co-presidents, so to speak, finally agreed to launch an attack on Fort George. So every single cannon was primed and ready to fire. So when they lit their own ships on fire, they exploded in a most amazing way. As for the men, they bolted into the woods and tried to find their way back to New Hampshire and Massachusetts before starving. Now, whoops, I did it again. There we go. I promise I won't do that a third time, or else we will all disappear. Now, many have labeled this the most devastating naval defeat that the United States suffered up until the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. One of the most important things that privateers did during the Revolution was to help bring France into the war on the side of the Americans. In the early years of the war, France allowed American privateers to reprovision, get new crew, and rest at French ports, both on the continent and in the Caribbean. All of this was in violation of treaties that France had with Great Britain. That, plus the damage done by the privateers, infuriated the British. The Continental Congress sent this gentleman, William Bingham, to the French colony of Martinique, where a large part of his job was to extend American privateering efforts. It worked brilliantly. In 1778, it was estimated that American privateers in and around the Caribbean and Martinique had captured 250 British ships, and that the volume of British trade to this region had fallen off by 66%. And to put that in perspective, the number one source of external funding for the British Empire at this time was their sugar plantations in the Caribbean. So alarming were these figures that the Earl of Suffolk urged Parliament to keep them from the public, pointing out the, quote, impropriety of acknowledging what ought not to be acknowledged at so critical a period, the weakness of the nation. Meanwhile, Benjamin Franklin, who was in France to negotiate a formal alliance, was convinced that privateering was helping the American cause while at the same time injuring Britain. That which makes the greatest impression in our favor here, Franklin wrote, is the prodigious success of our armed ships and privateers. London's Public Advertiser asserted that if France continued to allow American privateers to sail from French ports, an immediate war between France and this country will be the inevitable consequence. Now, the critical turning point in getting France to ally with the Americans in the war was the defeat of General John Burgoyne's army, British Army, at Saratoga on October 17, 1777. Privateering, while not causing a sharp turn in American fortunes entirely on its own, helped create the situation in which this great American victory could prove decisive in bringing France into the conflict. It did so by greatly increasing the enmity between France and Great Britain and also inflicting serious damage on the British economy. Now, arguably the most horrific chapter in the American Revolution concerned the prisons, British prisons, in England and in New York Harbor. In both places, American privateersmen made up the bulk of the prisoners. The two main prisoners in Britain were called Mill and Fortin Prison, and together they held roughly 3,000 men during the conflict. The death rates, annual death rates at these two prisons, was between 3 and 6%, which is on par for other prisons during this era. Now, Mill and Fortin prisons were bad enough, but by far the worst experience any combatant, American combatant, could endure was to stay on one of the British prison ships moored off New York City. Between 15,000 and 22,000 men were held on these ships. All of the prison ships were dreadful, but the Jersey was by far the worst. Nicknamed Hell Afloat, the Jersey had been a fourth-rate 64-gun British warship. And as you can see, it was moored not too far from land in shallow water, dismasted, and at any one time, it was the largest prison ship in New York Harbor. There were a total of 19 at one time or another. It was the largest, and between 800 and 1,200 men, prisoners, were on that ship. Just imagine, below decks, 800 to 1,200 men only allowed to come up to see the sun for less than an hour a day. Between 6 and 12 men died per day on the Jersey. Every morning as the sun rose, the guards would yell down, "Rebels, bring up your dead." And they would. Not only that, but the American prisoners would have to get in whaleboats and bring the corpses to the shore and bury them in shallow graves that were so close to the waterline that when bad weather struck, often those graves became exposed. Now, one inmate on the Jersey left this damning portrait of his time there. There were about 1,100 prisoners on board. There were no berths or seats to lie down on, not a bench to sit on. Many were almost without clothes. The dysentery, fever, frenzy, and despair prevailed among them and filled the place with filth, disgust, and horror. The scantiness of the allowance, the bad quality of the provisions, the brutality of the guards, and the sick pining for comforts they could not obtain, all together furnished continually one of the greatest scenes of human distress and misery ever beheld. The number of deaths on the Jersey alone is shocking. The best estimates point to it being being roughly 11,500, the vast majority of which were American privateers. By comparison, in the entire war, somewhere between 4,400 and 6,800 Americans were killed in action. One of the biggest criticisms of privateers is they sucked manpower from the Continental Navy. And that is absolutely true. Many men chose to become privateers because they thought they could make more money more quickly without any onerous naval regulations or rules to comply with. But that doesn't mean that had there been no privateers, that the Continental Navy would have been transformed into a fierce fighting machine. There are roughly 60 Continental Navy warships operating the Atlantic at various times during the war. Building and assembling a Navy from scratch would have been a gargantuan task for a well-functioning, well-funded government. The Continental Congress was anything but. They couldn't even levy taxes on the colonies. So they were inexperienced, poorly staffed, and financially strapped. And that's why, for the Continental Congress, pulling together a Continental Navy was almost an insurmountable challenge. The Continental Navy's record in battle is not an enviable one. 28 vessels were captured or destroyed, and many others were lost at sea, sold, returned to France, or burned to keep them away from the enemy. At war's end, just a few naval ships were left. There were, however, some bright spots for the American Navy. Raids on Caribbean munitions depots brought back much-needed ammunition and bullets, and Navy ships did an excellent job ferrying diplomats across the ocean as well as dispatches, and they captured roughly 200 prizes. Nevertheless, in July 1780, John Adams, who was a fan not only of privateers, but also of the Navy, would write, "In looking over the long list of vessels belonging to the United States, taken and destroyed, and recollecting the whole history of the rise and progress of our Navy, it is very difficult to avoid tears. The American Revolution was the Navy's first hour, but not its finest. In the absence of a powerful Navy, Americans relied on privateers. Under the circumstances, that was the best strategy available. On the home front, privateers contributed materially to the American economy. Privateering was a great economic boon for coastal towns and cities like Newburyport, keeping many businesses afloat during the war and creating new ones, as well as some new fortunes. And the money that privateersmen earned, when they did earn money, because many times they came back with nothing to show for it, sort of like whaling, but when they did earn money, it provided for their families and gave an additional jolt to the local economy. Each prize auction delivered a new stream of commodities into the colonies. In August of 1779, a thankful Pennsylvanian told Congress that privateers have rendered us the most essential services and brought us many articles for public and private use, without which the war could hardly have been supported. There was one privateer, however, who was very upset about his role in contributing to the local economy. He returned from a cruise in February of 1779 only to discover that his hard-earned savings had been depleted by his wife. He took out an ad in a local paper that read, "Whereas Elizabeth, the wife of me, the subscriber, has run me in debt while I was at sea, wasting my substance by riotous living, and as I am in danger of being further run in debt by the said Elizabeth, this is to warn all persons harboring or trusting her on my account for the future, as I will not pay 1 farthing from this date. Whether the marriage survived is unknown." The formal end of the war came on September 3rd, 1783, when the Treaty of Paris was signed. Surviving privateers were transformed into merchant ships, and they played their part in transporting America's wares to distant ports, proudly flying the new nation's flag. The men who owned and financed privateers, as well as those who had chosen to fight for their country on their decks, looked back on their accomplishments with pride and wondered, as did all Americans, what the future would bring for themselves and their new country. I couldn't end this talk without mentioning 2 Newburyport men who were an important part of privateering. Often Boardman, who is Bethany's historical crush, was the captain of the Newburyport privateer Washington. The Washington sailed from here in late December, and on January 15th of 1776, it captured the Suki, which was laden with supplies for British troops. After bringing the Suki into Newburyport, another ship appeared beyond the bar. Boardman and 17 men, all hiding weapons under their long coats, piled into 3 whaleboats to investigate. Upon arrival, Boardman hailed the ship, inquiring where it came from and where it was heading. "It was the Friends, sailing from London to Boston," came the reply from Captain Archibald Bowie. He asked what land was nearby and where the whaleboats had come from. Boardman responded, "We are from Boston. Do you want a pilot?" Those duplicitous Newburyport people. Indeed, he did, and welcomed the men onto the vessel. Boardman and Bowie shot the breeze for a few moments. Then Boardman abandoned the ruse and demanded that Bowie strike his colors immediately. Thunderstruck, Bowie complied. After that, the cargo from the Suki and the Friends was sent to George Washington at his headquarters in Cambridge, and some of that cargo were sensitive military dispatches that certainly were much appreciated by George. After all these books I've written talking about George Washington, I feel I can address him as George. So another Newburyport man was Nathaniel Tracy. He amassed an impressive privateering record during the Revolution. Between 1775 and 1783, he was the principal owner of 47 privateers, in addition to scores of other vessels engaged primarily in trade. His privateers captured 120 British ships, the cargo of which sold for nearly $4 million. But Tracy also lost most of his ships during the war, and at the end of the conflict, he was in serious financial trouble. And as I understand it, isn't the building, part of the building for your library, is his old house? Yeah. Anyway, Newburyport has a lot of wonderful history. Anyway, I just wanted to give a quick plug for my book, which is coming out on June 2nd of this year. It's about a whale ship out of New Bedford, the Mentor, that crashes into the archipelago of Palau in the Western Pacific. And it is a wild story that spans nearly 5 years. There are collisions of East and West cultures, the American whalemen, the natives on Palau. There are tribal wars, there are duplicitous negotiations, there's a open boat rescue attempt, which is rather dramatic. There are other rescue attempts, there's starvation, death, murder, a naval rescue mission. There's nothing about Newburyport in it, however, I'm sorry to say. But anyway, it was a fun book to write, and as I said, it's coming out in a couple of months, and that's it, so thank you. Oh, do you have time for questions? No, only if you have, only if you have time.
No, go for it.
Okay, are there any questions?
Can you repeat the question into the microphone?
Yes, right there, yes?
Hi there. The Castine debacle, where we scuttled our ships. I read something that Paul Revere was actually court-martialed for that event.
That is accurate. Paul Revere was there, and he was court-martialed essentially for cowardice or not following orders.
Question.
Oh, sorry. Read the question. Why is Newburyport such a great city? That's it. No, the question is, I understand that the Penobscot affair in Castine, which was a debacle for the Americans, Paul Revere was there, and he was court-martialed. And that is true. I read a little bit about that. I didn't include that in the book. And if I remember correctly, because I have to plumb the depths of my memory, I'm sure somebody here knows better, I think he was court-martialed, but it was rescinded. It was a long case. There's a lot of information about it. I know some people who have recently written about Paul Revere talk about it in their books. I don't talk about it in the book, but you are correct. I see a hand. Yeah, right. Yeah, right there. You right? No? What? Oh.
Is there a correlation with the street and
Is there a connection between Boardman Street in Newburyport and often Boardman? And for that, I have to turn to my research assistant, Bethany Groff-Durow. No, she says yes. Bethany Groff-Durow says yes. And if she says yes, you can bring it to the bank.
His house was on the corner of Water and
Even without Bethany's support, I am going to venture a guess. The answer is
Patrick Tracy
yes.
is his father.
Patrick Tracy's his father. I was about to say that.
This is like my favorite quiz show.
I don't see anybody else. So you're all done? Okay, thank you. Oh, no, one more.
The Mill prison, you said there were 3,000 people there at one point.
Between Fortin and Mill, yes.
How many escaped?
How many escaped? I don't, oh yeah. At Mill and Fortin Prison in England, there are about 3,000 people there during the war. How many of them escaped? I don't have the ultimate number, but in the book I talk about some rather daring, interesting escape attempts. And the people around Mill Prison in particular, they could bring in their wares during 1 day a week. So they could bring in wares, and the prisoners were allowed to make things or buy things or sell things. And there was a back and forth between the prisoners and the locals, and it got to the point where some of the prisoners bribed local citizens. If they escaped, they could stay in their houses. And it got really bad. There was a battle, not a physical battle, but a tug of war between the officials at the prisons and the locals who are helping with escape attempts in the hope of getting some emoluments. And anyway, it's in the book. I talk about, I don't know the ultimate number. It was certainly, I think it was scores. And often Boardman, didn't he escape?
Yeah,
Yeah, he escaped 4 times. So,
You'll hear about it later.
so yeah.
You do have a question on the stream. Our stream question is, are you familiar with the privateer ship America from Gloucester?
Am I familiar with the privateer ship America from Gloucester? I'm trying to, in writing the book, I read about many different privateers, and I had to select those that worked in the narrative. It's not ringing a bell, but my guess is I probably read about it, especially since I read, what's his name, the local author. He's really great. He wrote Guns of, what was his name? Anyway, there's a local newspaper guy that wrote a bunch of books about Gloucester, and one of them about the American Revolution. Garland, yeah, really good writer. And I think he talks about that ship in his book, but I can't elaborate any more. And I got to add one thing that's kind of curious about this. When this book came out, I gave talks all over the place. Invariably, somebody in the audience had an ancestor who was on a privateer, and after the talk or during the talk, they would ask me whether I knew their ancestor or I knew the privateering ship, and invariably, I had to say no, because there were so many ships and there were so many privateersmen. I only, it's not a 3,000-page book. And they were just so crestfallen. I felt so bad. And every once in a while, I get somebody who I can say something positive about. And I will add one more story because it's a Newburyport story. I gave a talk at the tannery, the bookstore, Jabberwocky, in the tannery, years ago on my Lighthouse book. And right before I start, there's a woman sitting in the front row. If she's here, come up and say hello to me. She said, "Is Plum Island Lighthouse in your book?" And I said, "No." And she goes, "Why not?" And I said, "Well, there were close to 1,500 lighthouses. I only talk about 160 of them. It just didn't make it into the narrative." And she proudly announced, right before I'm ready to talk, she goes, "Well, I'm not going to buy your book." So said, "You Newburyport people are really tough."
Yay, thank you, Eric. I will take our toughness as a compliment. I will also tell you that this book that you see here, The Wreck of the Mentor, I was incredibly privileged to be one of the first readers of it, and it is an extraordinary book. So, it doesn't have Newburyport in it, but a Newburyport woman read it. How's that? All right. I have been informed that there's tons of coffee, so feel free to go grab a refill. We are going to have an official break in a little bit, but I don't want any of you to suffer. I will also point out that you're going to hear from, as the day goes by, you'll see some illustrations that are used in multiple presentations and multiple stories by different aspects of the same people. There are some privateering experiences and voyages that are more well documented than others, and so we tend to look to those for additional information. So, you're going to get tired of looking at Offen Boardman by the end of the day, I promise you. He has a particularly wonderful experience